Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the colloquium. We're kicking off today with a very interesting panel, remembering South African movements of the 1980s. Unfortunately, we have one of the panelists is not able to attend, which is Elizabeth Schur. But fortunately, the remaining 2 panelists are presenting papers that are fascinating enough to fill that vacuum. We'll be going in the same order as people are on the program, which means that we will be shortly starting with Dr. Sarah Bruchhausen. Sarah is going to be talking to us on a paper, Remembering the Rural Offensive, Youth and Student Movements in 1980s Lebowa. Sarah is a research associate at the Joburg Institute for Advanced Studies, and her research interests center on living subaltern histories of emancipatory politics in rural South Africa, focusing on questions of social reproduction, common in and commons, as well as universal theorizations of emancipatory politics. And her publications have centered on the historical and political conjunctures between the Marikana moment of 2012 and the Mpondo revolts of 1957 to 61. Her more recent research is explicitly concerned with the relationship between the everyday and emancipatory politics within the historical context of ordinary women's struggles for freedom in the former Lebowa Bantustan. And she's also currently engaging with an archival project with the anti-apartheid cultural and diplomatic struggle icon, Barbara Masekela. So over to you, Sarah.
Okay, is this a thing? Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to be a bit note-bound in this presentation because I haven't quite found my sweet spot yet between like ad-libbing and reading. And so today is more of a reading attempt, and so I'm sorry if that sacrifices a bit of the mood and atmosphere. So this is an article that is currently under review with the Journal of Asian and African Studies, which comes out of my PhD research, and just a particular aspect within a much broader study. And so, yeah, it's called The Black Consciousness Rural Offensive, Student Activists, Youth Movements and Emancipatory Politics in Lebowa, 1970s and 1980s. So I'm going to begin by situating the paper within the broader historiography of South Africa's liberation struggle. Much of that historiography remains profoundly urban-centric, focused on the cities and also focused on the Congress movement and the intellectual figures who inhabited those spaces. Even as scholarship has returned to the Black consciousness tradition, it has tended to orbit around Steve Biko and other urban centers of thought, leaving less visible the more diffuse grassroots and rural manifestations of Black consciousness politics that shape political life beyond the cities. This paper turns attention to the former Lebowa Bantustan, which, yeah, there's a map, to remember the powerful forms of youth and student politics that took shape there during the 1980s. UDF reports from 1985 recorded the highest concentration of student and youth organizations in the country to be found in the Northern Transvaal. These movements emerged through overlapping organizational and generational networks, from BC University student activists at Turfloop in the 1970s to high school and non-schooling youth of the 1980s. Their politics were not confined to schools or national liberation slogans, but extended into local questions of land, livelihoods, and legitimacy, contesting the authority of apartheid and Bantustan officials, reclaiming community control over resources, and redefining what political authority could mean in rural South Africa. By tracing these rural student and youth formations, my aim is to broaden our understanding of how political subjectivity and emancipatory politics were forged in rural spaces during the late apartheid period. And to do that, we have to look back to the political groundwork laid in the 1970s and to consider Black consciousness as a rural political formation. So, although the 1976 Soweto uprising is widely regarded as a pivotal moment in South Africa's liberation struggle, its immediate reverberations were not uniformly felt across the country. High schools in the Northern Transvaal were largely unaffected. However, the lack of uprising in 1976 was not due to political apathy, but rather because student politics in the region had developed on a different temporal and spatial trajectory, one shaped significantly by the influence of student activists at Turfloop, a key site in the emergence and dissemination of Black consciousness from the late 1960s onwards and a birthplace of SASO. The student struggles at Turfloop for democratically elected SRCs, for the right to protest, and other campus-based education-related struggles are documented by other historians. And I pick up the story in this paper in the mid to late 1970s, some years after the SRC had been established and captured by progressive student forces. And the campus had become an intense site of rolling protests and security action. Yet, as these campus-based protests continued into the 70s, student activists began to take their political work off campus, building ideological and organizational links that would later fuel the high school community-based rural youth movements of the 80s. Theirs was not a purely intellectual or discursive project, as the political contributions of the BC tradition are so often reduced to in scholarly perspectives of the South African national liberation struggle. It was practical and embodied, a rural offensive campaign that sought to root Black consciousness politics in the everyday struggles and political aspirations of rural spaces. This rural offensive, initiated by BC students at Turfloop in the early 1970s, aimed to take political and social action beyond the university gates. Student activists organized trips to nearby villages to assist with community projects aimed at fostering dignified spaces and ways of living, laying water pipes, building toilets, clearing lands for communal gardens, erecting simple structures for use as clinics, creches, and community restaurants, and so on. These were not charity projects. They were acts of solidarity grounded in political commitment. They did this through bonds of solidarity with older BC activists, such as Mampela Rampele, who was living under banning orders in the nearby township of Lenyene, where she had been banished later in the decade. In the late 1970s, university students became involved in the resistance to forced removals, particularly in Botlokwa, which was about 50 kilometers away from the campus, where a massive onslaught by the state was being faced in the late 70s. They helped rebuild demolished homes and kraals and organized mass community meetings, spaces where the primary political contribution of the student activists was made through performance, culture, and debate. At these mass meetings, student activists facilitated cultural events, dance troupes, music groups, and drama societies that transformed the gatherings into what activists called open field days. These were political gatherings masked as apolitical/traditional cultural festivals, where villagers and students came together for a day of discussion, planning, performance, and collective learning. Central to these events were the freedom dramas. Oh, do you want to go to the next slide with the pictures? So these images I've taken from the Lebowa Times, which is obviously the local newspaper, which itself was for a period in the 70s and 80s captured by MUASA, the Black Consciousness Media Workers Association. So it's a wonderful source, but let me not get distracted. Central to these events were freedom dramas, political plays, poetry, and music performed in accessible, locally grounded language while grappling with questions of universal human emancipation. These performances dramatized the realities of apartheid schooling, the humiliations of rural poverty, and the hypocrisies of homeland rule. As such, they reflect a practical historical manifestation of what Brazilian theater practitioner and theorist Augusto Bal called poetics, or theater of the oppressed, in which theater is a weapon and it is the people who wield it. Through these gatherings, BC student activists helped to build intergenerational and interorganizational networks that crossed lines of age, gender, and locality. They worked with women's organizations like Mbaleko, with church groups, and with sympathetic lecturers in the Black Academic Staff Association, who hosted off-campus political events and helped protect the student status within the university. What emerged was a new praxis of political conscientization, influenced by the pedagogy of Paulo Freire, but rooted in rural lived experiences. It was not indoctrination, but dialogue, structured debate, cultural expression, and collective problem solving. This political groundwork laid in the 1970s would provide the organizational and ideological foundation for the village-based youth structures of the 1980s. And I turned attention to that now in the paper. And the subtitle I use is People's Power in Practice, the Rise of Rural Youth and Student Congresses in the 80s. By the mid-1980s, the seed planted in the 1970s had begun to flourish. Across the former Lebowa Bantustan, local youth and student congresses emerged, sometimes starting as small school discussion groups, sometimes as community-based collectives, and in many cases growing to mobilize thousands. This was a period often referred to as the Lebowa Uprising between 85 and 86, when youth and student activism reached an unprecedented scale. Youth organizations during this time issued an array of demands and prescriptions, including the removal of soldiers from schools, free access to textbooks, the abolition of age limits on enrollment, the right to elect student councils, and the dismissal of authoritarian or corrupt school staff. By 85 and 86, boycotts, marches, and uprisings had paralyzed many parts of the Lebowa administration. The education system ground to a complete halt. Young people gave voice to popular demands for justice, representation, and dignity, creating spaces of popular power that questioned the very legitimacy of local governance, often acting as de facto leadership in communities where traditional authorities had lost all legitimacy. These moments, though marked by violence and repression, represent a radical reconfiguration of rural political life. They brought new political subjectivities into being, young people acting not merely as students, but as protagonists in the struggle to reshape their social world. Turning now to the intersection of youth politics, women, and the commons, the rural youth movement was not confined to education. Across Lebowa, youth congresses became involved in direct struggles over land, water, and labor. In some areas, youth activists challenged the commodification and privatization of communal resources. For example, when local chiefs imposed fees for fetching water from communal taps in Gachuene location, young people organized resistance to put an end to the practice. In other villages, youth directly confronted the chieftaincy's practice of forcing women to work without pay on their own lands or the lands of white farmers nearby. By the mid-1980s, these campaigns have become widespread. Youth organizations declared that no woman is insignificant and that women should refuse to do unpaid labor imposed by traditional authorities. The youth, gathered in large numbers and willing to use violent tactics, physically chased away or otherwise quelled those governing elites who would not comply. Their actions not only alleviated immediate exploitation, but also challenged the patriarchal structures that underpinned Bantustan rule. For many women, particularly older women, these interventions were emancipatory. They regained time, autonomy, and control over their labor, and they saw the youth movements as allies in a longer history of rural resistance, one that stretched back to the anti-betterment uprisings of the 1940s and 1950s. In that earlier era, women's movements had proclaimed, "We will plow where we like, and we plow because we want food." Those were statements of autonomy and survival, declarations of collective ownership and social reproduction over private property and capital accumulation. In the 1980s, the youth movement reactivated these older emancipatory prescriptions, drawing on them to challenge new forms of enclosure and control. Thus, rural youth politics in Lebowa was not a generational revolt detached from history. It was a continuation of popular struggles for land, dignity, and equality, articulated through new actors and new organizational forms. The relationship between gender and generation was central to this movement. Meetings deliberately included women and older community members, embodying a political form that rejected the authoritarianism and exclusionary nature of tribal authority structures. This was a conscious attempt to model a different kind of politics, one grounded in equality and mutual accountability. As former youth leaders recall, young women, the female comrades of the youth congresses, although a minority in comparison with their male counterparts, were fully present in the work of the movement, including at night meetings, where they spoke, led, and they often took the most courageous actions. And I think that's quite distinct from some of the formations of COSAS that Emily Bridger and others focus on in urban centers. In some areas, young activists even worked as mediators in domestic disputes or in conflicts between parents and children, forms of political care that sought to stabilize community life and assert values of dignity and justice, although they admit that they were often far more successful in mediating between parents and children and less so in conflicts between wives and husbands. It was described as the adult issues that were just beyond their capacities. But nonetheless, they tried their best to intervene. The youth movements also revived the political cultural practices of freedom dramas, using performance and poetry as tools for political education and collective reflection. These embodied practices connected politics to everyday life and to the pursuit of equality across both generational and gender lines. At their best, these organizations enacted radical democratic alternatives to the patriarchal and hierarchical logics of both apartheid and the chieftaincy. Their politics, grounded in everyday struggles, exemplified what might be called an egalitarian politics of the common, a vision of life beyond domination, sustained through collective action. And so I've truncated the paper quite a bit, but this is where I have quite a few caveats that come back to the dominant historiography, which has an unhealthy and I think quite colonial gazy focus on witchcraft and the areas in the northern Transvaal, such as Bushbuck Ridge and elsewhere, where the spectacular form of witchcraft that has been given, associated with the title of witchcraft killings, has come to dictate the rural youth movements in this part of the country as just violent, out of control boys who wanted to be against all forms of generational authority, regardless. And so I've attempted to show how that it's a stereotype, right? Which means it's not true, it just means it's not the full truth. It's a small part of the truth in some areas, and in fact, I think there is a problematic politics informing why it looms so large in the literature. So that's just a bit of a caveat around the idea of this is not to romanticize these struggles. They lived up to their own political aspirations in uneven ways and were temporally fleeting at times and spatially limited. But nonetheless, there's enough archival traces and oral testimony to be gathered to build an understanding of this aspirational side of the movement politics. Otherwise, it would never have gained its popular status. So let me conclude. The article shows how the youth movement in Lebowa was deeply entangled with broader struggles over land, commons, and local governance. It was a movement animated by radical political aspirations and shaped by material constraints, repressive violence, and internal contradiction. Yet its significance lies not only in the forms of protest it generated or the institutional structures it disrupted, but in the subjective and organizational capacities it nurtured. These included the elaboration of democratic alternatives to apartheid and Bantustan rule, the assertion of youth agency in the face of coercive authority, and the reactivation of long-standing popular principles, such as the belief that institutions of local governance should be held radically accountable to the people, and that they should, for the sake of their own survival, ensure rural dwellers fundamental rights to uncommodified access to land and resources held in common, adequate for sustaining life-affirming social arrangements and economies. These statements were and still are not merely demands to be included in a broken and unjust system, but prescriptions for new ways of living collectively with old historical roots, stretching deep into the pre-colonial past, affirmed in collective struggle. To recover these histories is to challenge the dominant urban and Congress-centric historiography of South Africa's liberation struggle. It is to insist that rural spaces were not passive or peripheral, but central to the production of radical political imaginaries. The students and youth of the rural Northern Transvaal, present-day Limpopo, engaged in practices that broadened the meanings of political struggle. They forged solidarities across generations, reanimated older emancipatory principles, and placed subsistence-based commoning, egalitarianism, and participatory democracy centrally alongside their own education-related struggles and prescriptions. These histories disrupt the urban bias of much contemporary political memory and offer a rich account of what student movements have been and can be, To remember these movements is to resist the forgetting of rural spaces as sites of radical possibility. It is to recognize that struggles over land, labor, commons, and education have always been interconnected, and that rural youth have long stood at the forefront of demanding not only rights, but of politically prescribing new ways of living and organizing power. In the context of ongoing crises of inequality, dispossession, and exclusion, the rural youth and student movements of the 1970s and 80s offer not just a history to be studied, but a political archive to be reactivated. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. We're going to move immediately on to the next paper, and I think the two papers do speak very well to each other. And this paper is by Itumeleng Mokoena, who's an MA student in history at University of Johannesburg. She completed her BA in humanities with majors in history and political sciences at Northwest University. And her research interests include the histories of liberation struggle, focusing particularly on women. And the paper is a history of the female members of the Congress of South African Students in Sebokeng, circa 1980 to the mid-1980s. Over to you.
Hello, okay. Sorry. Hi, everyone. My study is on the Congress of South African Students, COSAS, with a particular focus on the female members or the former female members of COSAS in the Vaal Triangle, specifically in Sebokeng. Next slide, please. Right. So a lot of questions that I have is really, where is the Vaal Triangle and where is Sebokeng? A lot of people think that the Vaal Triangle is part of Johannesburg, but the Vaal Triangle isn't part of Johannesburg. And as you can see in the picture, the triangle really, it's a constitution of Vereniging van der Bijl Park and also Sasolburg. And Sebokeng is in Vereniging. Okay, next slide, please. So just a bit of, since I think I have a bit more time, background story of really Sebokeng. Sebokeng is the second model township in the Vaal Triangle, and the Vaal Triangle is preferably known really of the Sharpeville massacre that occurred in the 1960s. And the Sharpeville was actually the first model township, and Sebokeng was the second model township. It was built in 1965, and it was built by the apartheid government. And with the construction of Sebokeng, according to some of my research, Sebokeng, just like Sharpeville, was meant to be a township that can accommodate mostly Black people and have facilities, parks, schools, and so forth, just like Sharpeville, for instance. So basically, I think that's what the definition of a model township is. But later, of course, we come to find that this is actually not the reality, that infrastructure and so forth was not necessarily built in the township. So Sebokeng, I think it's one really, I think, is a township I found in my research. It comes really late because we have other model townships that really came early, like Alexandra and so forth. So it was built in 1965. And I actually come from Sebokeng, was born and raised there. And one of the earliest settlers came towards the 1970s. And it consists of numerous zones, but one of the first zones that were built in Sebokeng is Zone 13 and Zone 7. And it was built and divided into Zone 7, for instance, A and B. The A was for the Basutus, and the B section was for the Amazulus, which I think, again, is also meant to show really the segregation that was meant to develop or be created when the model townships were created, right? So still on the history of Sebokeng, I think it was also very difficult to find some of the history of Sebokeng because before COSAS was formed, I think it's important to see really what led up to the formation of COSAS. The branch in COSAS was only formed in 1918, Sebokeng, when it was formed in 1979. And lucky, through the interviews that I've conducted, I was able to speak to people who resided in Sebokeng before 1980. And really, after the Soweto uprising, some would argue that Sebokeng was not necessarily active before 1980 because really there isn't really a lot of resources that deal with what happened in Sebokeng before the 1980s, what happened or really in the Val Triangle, other than the popular Sharpeville massacre that we know the Val Triangle to really be about. So yes, in Sebokeng, in regards to schools, there were very few schools in, actually before 1980, I don't think there had been any schools that had been developed. So most students from Sebokeng were attending school in Everton. Schools in Everton like Sebokeng, there weren't really a lot of schools at that time. And even in the 1970s, and Sebokeng was first managed by the Sebokeng Management Board. Then it was managed by the Val Administration Board. And really, when it comes to service and service delivery in Sebokeng, it also was not it wasn't, according to the interviewees, a lot of services were not necessarily delivered, and it also really is the peak of rent increases as well from the 1970s. So after the Soweto uprisings, I think then with the Soweto uprising was a South African event that everyone knew. However, in Sebokeng, there weren't really riots, just like in Soweto, but of course, the Soweto uprising affected the area, Sebokeng, and this is where students became more, I wouldn't say mobilized, but aware of political issues that was occurring within the country that affected Black students in particular. Then most of the anti-apartheid organizations are banned after the Soweto uprising. This includes SASEM and so forth. And I think this is where we see the establishment of COSAS. And yes, with the establishment of COSAS and really to understand COSAS is what is COSAS and who formed COSAS and where was it formed, you know, the how, when, what type of questions. So COSAS is, or is, right, it's still here now, is a student congress that was formed by previous or former SASEM members who, of course, at that time, SASEM was already banned. And speaking to one of, I had, you know, the chance to speak to one of the people who established COSAS. The main objectives for creating COSAS was to have a student congress. I think it was the first student congress that focuses on the Freedom Charter, and it was a charterist movement. And COSAS was also established based on really the pros and cons of the banned organizations, and it was important that it is a long-term organization that will last for a very long time and not a seasonal one. Really an organization that will have a really long effect, or should I say a really long legacy. So that was how COSAS was formed. I think in the archives, I found an archival material of COSAS, and that is the constitution of COSAS, which I detailed in my paper, the structure, and it was divided into the NECC, COSAS, it was divided into regional and also national COSAS, and then the branch executive of COSAS. And in the Val Triangle, like I said, the branch was formed in 1980, and it was selected at that time. I also want to point out that there were also women who were part of formulating the constitution of COSAS from Soweto and so forth. In the Val Triangle, I'm not sure if there were women that were already part of COSAS or the executive of COSAS in 1980. However, there were women already involved in the formation of COSAS. And in 1981, this is going to be done because I'm going to try to really speak about the history of COSAS up until 1985. And we see that in 1981, 82, 83, it is where the government really, then after the Soweto uprising, comes with a plan which can be called the reforms. And these reforms were said to be reforms that really are going to fix some of the problems that were highlighted after the Soweto uprising, especially towards COSAS, really education-wise. And in education, we see that it was the commissions that were created to fix some of those problems. This is the DeLange Commission, which was named after one of the ministers at that time, to really say that, okay, we understand what happened during the Soweto uprisings, and we want to be able to create a unified education that is free for everyone. Unfortunately, then these commissions and these reforms were actually regarded as sort of a continuation of apartheid and not a unified democratic reform. It still aimed to create segregation, and according to the members of COSAS, it did nothing in simple terms, except for create further divisions and also create segregation. And it did not aim to improve the education of Black people. So this was what was happening. I know in some of the work on COSAS, they would argue that COSAS wasn't really active before 84 and so forth, but it was mainly part of school boycotts and so forth, but it was starting to be part of other issues, socio-economic issues in the country. And we see that leading up to 1983, this is where the government comes in and really establishes the tricameral parliament that was formed to create a House of Assembly that excluded the Black people and only included Indians, whites, and coloreds. So COSAS also started campaigning against and contesting against those elections of 1983 and campaigning against the tricameral parliament as well. And in 1983, and we see that there is really a change in COSAS where they move from student issues and demands, and they're getting into the issues of the community and also national topics like the tricameral parliament and so forth. And in 1983, this is when the town councils also come in, and town councils are picked for to manage areas such as Sebokeng, which most of the residents say that they were against because they couldn't be able to pick their own representatives. So I think in my study, a few researchers have spoken about how the effect of the distrust of town councillors really led up to the uprisings in 1984 in the Val Triangle. And COSAS was also part of this, and this is where more women in Sebokeng actually start to be part of COSAS and start joining some of the campaigns in 1983. And towards 1984, most of the interviewees and the women that I spoke to, nothing had changed, and mostly none of the services were still given. They still didn't trust town councillors. They believed that roads, schools, and so forth were not fixed, they were not developed. So then it was the announcement of the rent boycotts. The announcement of the rent increases, which then it further angered the people in Sebokeng and also COSAS members. In my study, Chidiso Matuna speaks about cognitive leadership. Cognitive leadership really, I think, is, with my own thoughts, defined as really when a group of students come together because of the social economic issues that they're experiencing. Not only the issues that they're experiencing at school, but also at home. And in my research, we see that in this period of time, it's very much a time whereby unemployment is also rising. In this community, I also touch a bit about also the increase of single parents at that time and also single mothers who were struggling to have funding for the students at school. And one of the demands of many other demands of COSAS is the demand of books, textbook, which they couldn't afford, uniforms, corporal punishment, and other issues that are related specifically to girls was sexual harassment as well, and how girls were being sexually harassed at school, but nothing was technically being done about it. And according to interviewees, it's more of maybe it was because that they were Black girls, that they would report the issue, but nothing would be done about teachers who were sexually harassing girls and anyone who was affected by the fact that they couldn't afford school fees and so forth, and they had to be expelled from school, which they regarded as unfair because education was very important to all students. So 1984 really in the Val Triangle is really about the rent boycotts and the increase of rent that was announced in July and August, which angered most. COSAS also had many affiliates. By this time, it affiliated with the UDF, which by the UDF was just a group of all the organizations. So COSAS was also encouraged to affiliate with the UDF and also the Val Civic organization. So by 1984, September, at the 3rd of September, is when the rent boycotts occurred and the Val uprising occurred. And the Val uprising is very important, it's very salient because it's remembered as one of the most historical events. A lot of people died. A lot of people were injured, including the police as well, throughout September. And it wasn't just a one-day event, it was from the 3rd, the 4th, and the remainder of 1984. And there were 2 stayaways that occurred, which COSAS was part of. I know when I read some of the material, it was said that women were quite reserved during the Val uprisings, but in my research, that's not true. Women were very much involved in the Val uprising. Within every campaign of COSAS, the rent boycott, also being involved with civic organizations, also being part of the 2 stayaways of 1984, and also a campaign that was led by COSAS, which was called the Black Christmas campaign. I think I'll just show you the pictures after. The Black Christmas campaign would advocated to continue protesting until the apartheid government did something about the situation at school and opposing the Bantu Education Act, which forced Black students to speak Afrikaans and the main medium of teaching and learning for Afrikaans. And by the end of 1984, none of those demands had been met and nothing had been changed. And in 1985, it's also a very important period because it is the peak of the people's power, the people's liberation, and the people's education, which COSAS members and COSAS females were very much part of. And in the interviews that I conducted, some of them were part of the Education Crisis Committee. So COSAS was very much involved in people's education. And I think some of them have detailed about what people's power means. And the people's power in the Val Triangle, for instance, by 1984, it was about uniting parents, the students, and the workers. So COSAS was very much involved in forming the VAL parent organization and also the VAL Teachers Progressive Organization. And in 1985, then in June, then it's the state of emergency and COSAS is banned, which is also a very important part of my research, because really the question is then what happens to COSAS after that when it is banned? And some of the women, the executive of COSAS was arrested. What did they do? Were they still part of COSAS? Could they be able to mobilize and still, but I think the people's education was very important, because at this time you really see a shift around what roles and kind of gender roles that women should have. And the women were starting to have an influence on their parents, that they could be part of the organization, they could be part of violent uprisings, and they could be part of, many of them could have a future in university instead of preparing to have a husband and children and so forth. So this is what, in simple terms, is very important about the people's education, and also the Education Crisis Committee, and also the formation of the National Education Crisis Committee. Okay, I think that's pretty much it with the history of COSAS. And yeah, I think, can you just go back? Yes, and you can see that's the SRC, that's the campaign for the Black Christmas campaign that was continuing in 1984 in Sebokeng and the Val Triangle, which the women also participated in. Okay, the next slide. And the gaps of my research, as I've already spoken about, is there's very limited resources on COSAS, very limited resources. This also includes in the archives, and this even also includes in the secondary material as well. And when COSAS is mentioned, it is only pertaining to the male members of COSAS. And nothing has been written on the female members of COSAS, especially in the Val Triangle and especially in Sebokeng. So yeah, pictures that I've just attached here is a reference book, because COSAS, I think, was involved in and had demands on particularly everything, past laws, like I said, the Tricameral Parliament, the Groups Area Act, mainly all the apartheid policies. They were against it. So I've attached, a reference book which they believed was also a problem for Black people to find more jobs. So COSAS was also against that, and that is just a picture of when COSAS was banned and the killings that are associated with the Val uprisings. It's the next slide, please. And so in conclusion, and my argument is not necessarily just that there's limited resources on COSAS. My argument is also that female members were more than just female recruiters. They had the role and responsibility not just to recruit more females in the organization. Actually, with some people that I've spoken to, the males also had the role to include more females as well. So in some of the materials that all the materials that I've consulted, it really gives the idea that women were just female recruiters, but they were part of most of the campaigns of COSAS, not only with the role that they should recruit more females in the organization, right? So yeah, COSAS was a non-racial, non-sexist, and it advocated for equal and democratic society for all, for everyone. It was non-racial, okay? Of course, with the particular focus of problems is that were pertaining to Black students and Black women, but it was a non-racial organization. So I argue that due to the people's power, really, even though COSAS did advocate for women's rights, it also advocated that women should be part of the organization, which also caused that in the Val area, more females, mothers and so forth should be attracted to COSAS. I believe that this made COSAS more attractive due to the people's power, because we do see that more parents start also getting the idea that females could join liberation movements and anti-apartheid movements, instead of saying that they should be overprotective of their daughters, because the people's power advocated that everyone should be involved in opposing apartheid and apartheid laws. So that's mainly my argument. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Itumeleng, for that very interesting input. Okay, we've got just over an hour left for contributions from the floor. I think these two papers do speak not only nicely to each other, but also to the themes that we're thinking about when we're thinking back to Fees Must Fall. You know, just to make a couple of preliminary observations, I think the kind of rural-urban contrast is quite useful for us, and the focus on youth movements is of interest, as well as being reminded about the idea of people's education. That was, if you like, a forerunner to some of the demands in FMF, or FMF being a continuation of those impulses in some ways. And of trying to complete them. But also the fact that both movements saw that their scope of activism was not only their own immediate education demands, but actually the whole of society, which again I think is something that that did come out of FMF, was more and more the question about what kind of society can accommodate the kind of education we are looking for. You know, so I think if we, and also both cases I think speak in different ways about the potential invisibility of certain actors, as we also see in FMF, actors who were central to the movement. So Carbon spoke yesterday about trans activists in Cape Town being a driving force in the movement, but often left out of the archive. And in Itumeleng's case, looking at the important role of women activists. And I think in both cases, and I'd like to invite us to approach the discussion also thinking about these not just, as Sarah put it, I can't remember the exact words, but not only as an archive of the past, but potentially an archive of the future, in thinking about what can we take from these previous examples. So that should have given you enough time to think of what you want to say. So I'm going to hand it over to the floor. And if there's anyone online, can you just let me know? Sure. Okay, cool. So that.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for those beautiful presentations. I was particularly interested because I was born in the 80s, so it's good to know what was happening around the time when I was born in different places. And I think my question will be addressed to both of you. I believe you can both answer me this. But I see that it looks like isolated events that are happening, yet there's also a bit of it. You're fighting the same cause, but it looks like you are doing different things. So the Lebowa stuff and the Val Triangle stuff. So I want to know, was there ever an effort from both sides to expand your call or your fight for the struggles that you're fighting against? Well, we all know that it was a general problem in the country. You know, everyone was against the apartheid and all of the apartheid stuff. But was there ever an effort to unite and fight the same cause? Maybe like from the people, was there ever a call that was made by both. That's why I said my question is for both of you, you know, from the Lebowa group and from the Val Triangle group, and how, if there was ever a call made, how far did it go? What did it help, or was there no interest from anyone else outside to assist in the struggles that the people were fighting for, you know? And for COSAS, I want to know further, where is COSAS right now, and how loud is the voice of COSAS today? Did it die? Did it grow over time? Did it start dying after it was formed? And is there a future for COSAS to do anything more in our country? So yeah.
Hey, thank you. So my question is also to Itumeleng. COSAS Sebokeng, Simon Nkodi is quite famously one of the founding members, and his kind of struggle with homophobia, I mean, we know it, but often in relation to the men in the movement and on the island. So I was wondering if you had any of those conversations with women. It would be just interesting to know if there was a different dynamic there.
I'm very interested in the relationship between the students, which have been this subject matter of your very good papers, and their teachers. You haven't said much about the teachers, and I can imagine that some of the teachers must have been horrified and scared for their lives by watching what the students were doing, and others might have been very supportive and creative for the students. Knowing something about other parts of the world where there have been student eruptions of this sort, the role of teachers are very complicated, and the high school and university administrations that get involved are also very complicated, as we know. And I'd love to hear something about that sort of intermediate role in the hierarchy of the processes that COSAS was going through.
Thanks. I think we've got Chris Nett.
Oh yeah. My question goes to the lady who spoke about COSAS. As you conducted your research, I want to know: do you think we're still finding those women mentality in this current era, or are we finding this mentality in particular political parties, perhaps? Or you think it needs, if we don't find that mentality anymore, you think it needs to be revived again within the academic institutions? Because remember, during the 80s, I think time has changed and women are facing different struggles right now. We have now gender-based violence, which is really, really in the pinnacle. So do you think COSAS need to be revived again? And what are the things that they need to address right now? Because back then it was more about liberation struggle. But today, do you think there are specific areas that need to address? What are those areas that you think they need to fight against? Thank you.
Thanks. I have a couple comments and a couple questions. I mean, the one is that I think, Sarah, the point you made about at the end that this wasn't just a generational revolt. And I think so often in relation to student and youth struggles, there's this idea that it's a generational thing. So I mean, even with Fees Must Fall, for example, just building on what Claire was saying, it's like, oh, it's a generational revolt, it's 76 reloaded or so. And I always found that conceptually very weird because they're very different kind of moments, right? I mean, Will Shoki's piece, editorial this week in Africa as a Country, where he kind of critiques this notion of a Gen Z uprising in Nepal and blah, blah, blah. But I thought that's a very interesting point, but I think it's also not just in relation to your case that you're dealing with here, but like conceptually how we deal with the concept of youth and revolt together. And we kind of suspend it as always this generational moment rather than part of like longer struggles, community struggles, you know, different forms of organizing, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, then the other point, again, building on Claire and just the broader themes we've been dealing with around Fees Must Fall, is that both of these papers, I think, speak to something that happened in Fees Must Fall, where women students recognized the missing pieces of this history in the record that they had been taught and actively resisted that erasure, right? So it wasn't just a part of political practice in that moment, but it was an actually thought through idea that we are going to resist our own erasure from this moment. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of how both these sets of histories have been told and the work that you guys are doing in relation to women in various struggles. So those are two. I have a question. Sarah, and maybe it's an unfair question. What happened afterwards is what I'm interested in, both in terms of the ideas and organizationally, because there's this area that is now clearly very steeped in forms of Black consciousness politics, and you're bringing this back onto the table for us, and I'm kind of interested both in terms of the organizations and the ideas, what happens after that moment. And then for Itumeleng, the active recruitment of women, I found an interesting part of your paper. Was that just did that just come in a package with like general Congress style politics of non-racialism the language of non-sexism, non-racialism, non-sexism, democratic, blah, blah, it kind of comes just a little bit later than the period you're working with. So I guess what I'm asking is, were those ideas already present in COSAS from the early 1980s? Right, thanks.
Thanks. Anyone else for this round? Okay, I'm going to take, can I give it back to the presenters to take on some of those points, and then we'll see if there's a second round. Sure.
Okay, I go first. Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. I think I have 4 direct ones that I'll try to address. So to the gentleman here, you were talking about, I think, almost reinforcing the division between countryside and urban, and these seem like very isolated events. And were there efforts ever to unite city and countryside? So, yes, I'm a classic historian, so I would start at the beginning, but I think I need to go further back. So I would say that from the 40s and the 50s, at a high organizational level, the ANC had its quote-unquote peasants' wing in Sebokeng, which is a migrant labor organization moving from the Rand back to countryside. They were less successful in forging the organizational links in other parts of the country at that time during the anti-colonial revolts, like in Mpondweni. During the Mpondo revolts, there were requests made to the ANC for guns and logistic support. Governor Mbeki was highly supportive, but he couldn't get agreement of the other high command. So there were attempts, but of course, within African nationalism, there was also feelings that, you know, these people are like fighting with sticks and stones. It's a bit backward. We're a modern institution. So there was that division. By the time you get to the 70s and 80s, it's also important to remember that the youth are not struggling in a vacuum. You have the labor movement, especially after 73 with the reforms. And also that whilst all of apartheid South Africa was under very repressive conditions, the Bantustans had their own sets of apartheid rural legislation. So even after the, I forget how I said, the VNAN legislation of the early 1970s, which created the ability for the independent Black radical trade movement to re-emerge, such allowances weren't given in Lebowa and other Bantustans until 1991. So that's not to say that there wasn't trade union activism, there was, but it was very limited, it was very clandestine, and it was mostly based around Seshego, Linyene, your rural townships. They were really great at in forming the local youth congresses there with documents, with reports, with almost one-to-one links with what COSAS was building, primarily in the urban townships of the Vaal and elsewhere. Literature such as Learn and Teach magazine, Grassroots, other stuff like that. In the more rural villages at a distance from like Seshego and Mchelereng and those areas, COSAS students would come home during school holidays, and some, particularly Sekiba Lekhwati's work around Zebediela shows their role in hosting meetings and so forth and converging in the same way Turfloop students were coming in. There were students coming back from the Rand and from the Vaal and spreading. So that's how they dovetailed with those COSAS free textbooks. The one struggle that wasn't necessary was against the Afrikaans language, because in the Lebowa Bantustan, the two official languages were Sepedi and English. So there were some minor, differences as well when it came to those demands. But there definitely were attempts to make those links. How successful they were depends on where you're looking at organizational capacity. How the ideas moved, I think, was very successful. But then the organizational credit, was this BC ideas and ideology? Was it Congress aligned or charterist ideas? In Limpopo at this time, there was so much hybridity and plurality, and it really is messy when you get down to it at an experience, at the lived experience of being involved as a comrade in the youth movements or in labor. So that's how I would answer. And of course, you have the underground in the area as well, building as well, the MK underground networks, the Upper underground networks, and those cadres, the veterans who come back from Robben Island after 1970, between 1973 and 1976, they release Peter Itumeleng, Flag Boshielo and others under banning orders. They can't go back to Joburg and Pretoria where they were organizing in the labor movement. They get sent home to their rural villages and they start organizing amongst the youth. So we can see how BC at the time when Congress is forced underground really lays that groundwork. And as Congress starts re-emerging, it's able to appropriate, extend, and in many areas it looks almost uncontentious because that ideological battle didn't matter as much as dealing with this particular issue on the ground. The second question was about student-teacher relationships. So in my research at Turfloop, the Black Academic Staff Association, BASA, was a really important organization for those students. And their sort of public facingness in the archive comes through the Lebowa Times, where they write a lot of articles detailing student protest in as much of a sympathetic light as the apartheid editorial board will allow through. In addition to that, in the oral history interviews I conducted, it was very similar to Fees Must Fall, just in terms of like protecting students' DPs, trying to make sure that if they're missing classes for any reasons because they're involved on a Friday in organizing a political event on a Saturday, that they cover them. Or they're doing research assistant work for me, like, or whatever it was. And then also booking venues off campus, and because it got to the point by the late 70s where using campus as a venue for this type of conscientization work just wasn't possible for these issues that were beyond. I really want to emphasize that campus still was very much a hotbed of student education related activity, but my paper tries to focus on what they did in addition to that. Ambitiously, I'm trying to think of them in the vein that Kirsten Ross and others look at May 68 and how students go outside of their subjective and physical domain of student interest to join workers and unemployed and act beyond that interest in excessive ways. So very important, and because the lecturers themselves were often under focus, the librarians, the canteen workers. So Rejoice Maputefasi, who became the regional chair of the UDF after Peter Itumeleng was assassinated in 1876, she started as a librarian at Turf and was highly involved in stretching the students' organizational activities into Seshego. But I don't really trace that in this paper because I focus on Botlokwa. Okay, then finally to Taz's point around generational revolt. Where you're there now. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think one way to mitigate that almost flippant reaction of this is a generational revolt against all forms of authority is to insist that when one thinks about generational, one has to think about gender. They come together. And I think that's why these seem like such alternative narratives to the mainstream discourses of both COSAS and less organized, formally organized modes of student politics, is that they're so androcentric in the existing literature to the point where they interviewed very few women. They didn't ask gender-specific questions relating to kind of social reproduction and the way that women live their lives in both township and village spaces. And so this is very much, I think, in the vein of like a Helen Bradford just taking on like Colin Bundy and others, and just saying if you shift your focus to looking at women's experience primarily, you don't get a rise and fall of a peasantry narrative. In fact, you get a very different trajectory of change over time. And so I think gender mitigates that. If you take seriously what women, what queer people were struggling for in Fees Must Fall, the demands they articulate, when you list those up next to the statement, this is an outright generational revolt, the two don't match. It's like, well, then why were they like saying, you know, the struggles of our parents? And anyways. And then, yeah, so I think the other point that I thought about off of your comment, and something that came up yesterday in discussion as well with Shivu and you outside, is looking at youth movements, whether it be Fees Must Fall or the youth movements of the 80s, as, have I read this? No, let me just do it properly. There's a brief video from Audre Lorde where she talks about being Black and lesbian in the 1950s. And she articulates how the civil rights movement created the movement from which interests which weren't being articulated, in that case, Black lesbian women's interests, could then articulate themselves. But the movement was essential for that articulation to be possible. And that articulation often wasn't like easy, it was crunchy, it got hit back, and leads, you know, to her other statements around how, but silence doesn't protect you. Like you're going to continue to be getting all forms of nonsense if you don't stand up anyways. So I think that, yeah, also came forward for me in terms of the Black consciousness legacies. That's more of a conversation we have to have afterwards. I hide behind subaltern studies to not have to worry too much about what happens at the trajectory of macro tradition. Okay, thank you.
It was so interesting because, like, our chair mentioned that it's really similar, so I'm very interested, especially towards the Black consciousness as well, because my focus is more on the Charterist movement, and so thank you. The question, like already mentioned, it was difficult to sort of link the townships. I already spoke about some of the strategies. I think David Walsh speaks about the apartheid government and the reforms that it created and how it was really, really working hard to create segregation. So it was difficult for segregation to be non-existent, basically. And I spoke about the model township that Black people were forced into Sebokeng. Most were living in parts of Everton. Everton was actually a freehold area where Black people could own land, and they were forcibly removed from Everton and led into Sebokeng. And of course, like I've already mentioned, it was made to seem that this model township would improve the lives of Black people, that there would be, for instance, flush toilets, water, electricity, but those services were not given. But it was very difficult for that's why I think her research is also so interested in speaking about rural areas, because we don't really get a chance to really think. We really think that it was quite since nothing was happening around rural areas and so forth. So I think that is mostly related also to segregation and the apartheid laws. And I think the second question regarding Simon Nkoli, I know he was the deputy chair of the first COSAS executive branch in Sebokeng. There also hasn't been much written about him and so forth. And I think, I don't know about his experiences in COSAS, but heading towards 82, 83, speaking to the earliest members of COSAS, they don't really mention him much. I know that he was also arrested and part of the Damos trial. The Damos trial is also very important towards the VAL triangle, because all the Damos trial detainees were from the VAL triangle. Almost all of them were from the VAL triangle and part of other organizations such as the VCA and the UDF members. So with Simon Nkoli, still very limited resources. The interviewees did not mention him, honestly. They did not mention him. And I know that Simon Nkoli, there is a diary entry in the Wits Historical Archives. Maybe you can have a look at that when he was arrested. There is a diary entry that has been uploaded at the Wits Historical Archives, and he explains in detail what happened during the uprisings from September up until December, and his experience in the being part of the Damos trial as well. So yeah, maybe you can look into that a bit more, because I do know that he has been mentioned as a deputy chair when COSAS branch was formed in Sebokeng. And the question towards the role of teachers, I think, is very important when it comes to the VAL triangle. Unlike other areas, according to the interviewees, and I really tried to stretch the role of teachers as much as I could, especially towards COSAS and COSAS being formed, because like many have argued, nothing was happening in Sebokeng before 1980. Preferably, well, according to them, they did not riot or they did not even have organizations that were formed yet, compared to areas such as Soweto and so forth. However, towards 1985, this is why COSAS members also found it very important to create teachers committees and parents committees, because according to them, they did not have teachers that were, enlightening them, and that's why the people's education was also very important. I know that one of the interviewees mentioned that in regards to people's education, they were in contact with white liberals from the Wits University, and he also explained and spoke a bit more about how, students at the Wits University was so liberal, and they were willing to, for instance, share books with them, literatures with them. That is one way that they also found books that was, of course, not available in school, because part of the people's liberation was to also include the history of the Black people as well, and not have a very Eurocentric idea of history. They also wanted to know about Nelson Mandela. They also wanted to know about the women. Most of them would say that they didn't even know about the history of the 1950s, of the Women's March and so forth, and they were able to get access to that. They also mentioned the Black Sash. Many of them were trained by the white liberals from the Black Sash, and I know that she also mentioned community projects. They also had community projects whereby they were trying to attract more women in COSAS and really trying to educate the people about the history of South Africa. And so in the VAL triangle, there weren't really teachers that were liberating the students and speaking to the students. And this is why in 1985, they really emphasized on the people's power, saying that teachers and parents should also be involved in the struggles of the students, and also for mothers as well, for women, not just Black women, to know that they can go to university, that they do not have to necessarily plan to have children at 18. One of the reasons was to also eliminate teenage pregnancy, where even with some of the interviewees, some were already pregnant at 18, and they were also trying to establish really the ideas that, okay, mothers, your daughters don't have to necessarily have kids at 18 or 19 years old. They can go to university, and also increase the idea of even birth control, of saying that, women can go to university, go and work. They did also mention that the affiliate was also with COSATU, because as I mentioned, COSAS was meant to be a long-term organization that really made an effect, to say that when women leave high school, they can be doctors and teachers and engineers, even if they wanted to. It's really a lot, because they really spoke about so much also in school with subjects, that women should have subjects like sewing and they couldn't do math and science, and so forth. So, and this is what basically COSAS was saying, that we need to establish parent committees and teachers committees, because the teachers are not necessarily fighting this battle with us. And that's why I argue that COSAS was more than just fighting about women's rights. It really changed the perspective of really the role of women in the society, and even influencing their parents, that women could also be part of FET. So I know that some parents also wanted to be part of the ANC later on, and so forth. So yeah. And the question of women and can more be done, the changes, the transitions. I do think that there has been change in knowledge and speaking more, especially speaking more about women and their role in society and women's rights. I think people really underestimate the journey that women have really gone on, and really establishing rights for women, especially in careers that women one day would be doctors, engineers, or even at times even have a career that's very male dominated as well. And I believe that our country has really gone a long way, because women are getting into careers and goals that you would say that are very male dominated. And I do believe that more could be done on the topic of women and their roles, because they are widely excluded from the history. I believe that they are widely excluded from the history and the role that they played into education, and also liberating education regarding women's roles, jobs, and so forth. So yes, I do believe that more could be done, because also with students, just in general, a topic and conversation about that, I do think that more could be done, especially for the youth, young people who are still learning about the role that women can play and future career perspectives that they can have. And I think the last question, I think Tasneem asked me if really the concept, or really the motto of COSAS, because their motto is literally in the 1980s was a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic and equal society. I would say yes, because the constitution, when it was drawn up, it did include this, but like mentioned before, it was a process to make this idea and objective known, because it was, I think, one of very, very few freedom charterist organization. Each organization had their own belief of nationalism, African nationalism, but COSAS was aiming for a democratic society, and it had always included women, and saying that it does need more women to be part of the political activities in South Africa. And I think before 1980s, there was already a topic about this of women in the 70s, in the 60s were possibly part, but it's very also limited as well. But it was definitely from when COSAS was established, and the constitution does include all of that. But the practicality of it and achieving that did take sometime towards 1983. And then when everything explodes, 1984, when really the rent boycotts, bus boycotts, school boycotts start occurring, that's when you see really women start joining COSAS. And yeah, I also do agree with you when you speak about their intellect between, fees must fall or student issues that we have. I think it's because people think that, I know my lecturer at ANW used to say that history sort of has a way of catching up to us because there are some similarities, but definitely there are a lot of changes in regards to our experiences in a democratic society now. And we do need people to identify, just like within COSAS, they were trying to identify what is the difference between the 1980s and the Soweto uprisings. The students there, they explained that they wanted to see the pros and cons, and where COSAS, for instance, where there are cons, COSAS can work more on that. So I think it's just confusing because already mentioned there are so many similarities for free education. COSAS was also advocating for free education, free textbooks, because they could not afford these in, it was, well, in high school, and now it's university, but the problems are still similar in a way. So I do agree with you on that. Thank you.
Thanks. We've got time for a couple more questions or comments from the floor, if there's anyone. Sure, over there, please. If you can just wait for the mic so that people online can also hear.
Thanks very much for great presentations. This is for Sarah. You mentioned about the influence of Freire on the rural movements, and I was just interested how that influence took place. Were it that his books were being read, or I know Freire was also involved in a kind of international collaboration of churches that were also involved in the anti-apartheid movement. So I wonder if you could just elaborate on how that influence kind of took place in forming the conscientization.
Okay, morning to everyone. My question is actually based to Itumeleng. She makes really great points, I think, with the touching back on the history of what happened during those times. But I'm really interested in the current, when you look at the situation right now in South Africa in terms of like the youth, I think there's this strong nudge of the youth being silenced. And I'm really interested, what do you imagine, has COSAS evolved? Does it have a place or a voice currently right now with the, so many, challenges, affecting, particularly within the education sector, where I think youth would have really something to really, say, with the curriculum, with, I think, yeah, my question is centered around it. Thank you.
Yeah, on that one, everyone, good morning. It's the language in the 70s. They were talking about black power, and COSAS comes around to talk about people's power. Today we have the youth. What is happening with the youth today? Are we waiting for some spark that will make everybody march up? Or is it the language that has been activist language? What happened? Are we waiting? I mean, the Chancellor Mkondas will tell you that in July, the riots, it was a missed target. So I understand all this. It's not a generational thing, it's just a language that changes every 10 years or every decade. So what would be the language today for the youth to rise up and say, enough? You told us black power, go to school, you are here now. We're sitting with our degrees at home. So what is language that will just make it happen for the youth? Thanks.
My name is Jaja. It's a comment. It's a comment and a question for Itumeleng, right? So there's something I noticed concerning COSAS when I was in high school in the mid early 2000s. Ne? We were a threat to the ANC and the PAC. We were a threat to political parties because the COSAS in high school were immune from influence from political parties. So one thing, there was a protest which was not archived in 2007 and 2006. COSAS in the East End organized a protest to Pretoria. There was vandalism, student got shot, there was a lot of chaos that happened. In retrospect, when I think about it now, the government notices the threat COSAS has towards the current establishment. Because I know for a fact when we were doing COSAS protest, the police couldn't shoot us with live bullets. They had to shoot us with rubber bullets. So we can go hardcore like Marikana, but we will not be killed like Marikana. Sort of. So COSAS has an post-apartheid South Africa is a threat to the current establishment. Because COSAS also works as sort of like a clandestine movement. Because at high school, around 1 p.m., there's a meeting of COSAS. No one knew, we're just in the toilets. There's clandestine activities which are part of COSAS, which the current establishment is aware. And for example, if you're a member of COSAS in a high school, the ANC, the EFF will recruit you for their own political things. So COSAS, I really love your courage of the erasure. Hence, someone was talking about erasure. So now in my mind, I'm like, ish, as a South African, they also erased the importance of COSAS in my own lived experience. Because now if I want to go to COSAS in the township schools, it's going to be hard for me because now they are captured by the ANC youth leagues, the EFF. So it's no longer transparent anymore. And the last question I wanted to ask, how was COSAS involvement in the FMF revolution? Because me, I was in the township, there's this thing called the missing middle. I did want to go to FMF protest, but I was like, ash, my case is not legit because I'm not a student. And COSAS in the township, only the people who know about going to university were involved. So my question is, how was the FMF and COSAS during the protested verse? Can you please enlighten me on that? Thank you very much.
There's the person in the white t-shirt, please.
Hi, my name is Lakim Kobole. My question is directed to Sarah, because you mentioned that young people there, obviously they were using like drama plays to conscientize. So I wanted to know, in your research, were you able to find like what kind of drama plays were they producing and making at a level of themes, content? Because if you look at drama plays that were produced by Gibson Kent, who else? I think Bongeni Ngema, it was like Black Power, and then you go across the sea. In the US, you study Theater of Black Consciousness by Amiri Barak. So it's very clear about, the black artist, what kind of content, themes that, we should make, because the stance is you must not produce plays that obviously reflect the values of the bourgeoisie as a working class, artist. So I wanted to find out if you were able to, and even when you read the African theater, the African theater plays, it's very clear on on the status quo. You also visit who's this? When you spoke about theater of the oppressed, right? And then also indigenous storytelling, because it's not only about young people drawing from, European or the Caribbean makers. We also have our own stories. How do we break from, narratives to, yeah. So I hope my question is clear.
Next, we've got
I actually want to bring you into the conversation. As someone who's been an organizer for a long time, I wonder if you could reflect a bit on the themes of both gender in organizing and as a teacher now, dealing with students, and as a teacher during Christmas Fall. So maybe you could reflect on some of those questions too. Yeah, Sarah, I didn't come back to you.
I will try and think about that very quickly. Is there any other points?
Yeah, I just want to make a...
Have you got the mic?
I have got it, yeah. It's just a quick point about the COSAS comment was interesting, so thank you for that. But particularly the point that, you know, you wanted to be involved, but you're not a student, so you don't feel like it's legitimate. It's also, I guess, far away. There's like a real physical constraints to participating. And just because it came up in the opening conversation, I thought I would comment again on the fencing of the university and the way that that kind of delineates this division between the student, the member of the WITS community, and then everything beyond. Whereas, of course, sorry, relatedly, during Fees Must Fall, protests were, and this I've picked this up in other historical protests as well, the presence of non-university students in student protest is like used to delegitimize protest. Who are these people? They're not even students. But a point that's been made a couple of times about Fees Must Fall was that a lot of the people who weren't even students were students who had been excluded, you know? They were ex-students and who were now kind of physically locked out of the space. And then, of course, there's like a whole group of people who kind of self-exclude or who are kind of automatically excluded by university not being an option. And those are also kind of legitimate participants in everything that is unfolding still, you know? So that's...
My name is Brian. Maybe I'm just making a follow-up. There's something which I'm not clear from someone who commented. My understanding of COSAS was a student organization mainly focused on high schools. Yeah, it is not connected to universities. Most students working at a high school to make, that's my understanding.
So I just wanted to piggyback off the question around theatre, but directed at COSAS about the stencils that were used for the mass meeting posters, and if you knew anything about the collectives behind making them.
Is it still morning? Good morning. Mine, I just wanted to direct the simple question to Itumeleng in relation to the contribution of COSAS in the discourse itself and the striking. If we can see that one of the, from your abstract, one of the key concepts there, it has to do with education, because they were at the center of having to influence and shape the education system that they were engaging in. But at the same time, I also want to take it back to the first speaker, who is not here, in relation to our future. I mean, I want to understand the contribution of COSAS in terms of the linguistic ultimate inequality or the linguistic genocide that we're experiencing as part of the system or the curriculum that they are experiencing today, their contribution in shaping the future. Do they still have that voice? And in that, having that voice, what is the deconstruction of the curriculum that we are having? For example, as we speak today, the very same 1976 uprising, which the discussion at the center of it was the issue of access to education, but that's when that was a by the way issue. The question was the question of language, to say that in order for us to access the education, we need to be taught, the system needs to utilize our native language. So in relation to that, they were trying to show us, or they were trying to bring the idea that in order for Africans to experience the economical will, or to attach the economical relevance to their language, it needs to be used, and in order for it to develop. But if it's not being used, it cannot develop, which also give us the element of linguistic genocide, to say that they're suppressing these languages, and the system itself and the education itself doesn't give these languages the economical relevance and economical weight. So what is their contribution in shaping this to allow that at least let's try by all means to attach the economical relevance to this language, to be taught physical science in native languages, to be taught physical sciences in native, to give this language power. So what is their contribution in relation to that? What needs to be done? Because we are thinking of the future, because the resolution of 1976 as today, they are not being met, because the question of language was never achieved, but the constitution was achieved, which says that all official languages need to be used equally. But in terms of implication and utilization, we are still far behind in achieving that. So what is their contribution in relation to that?
Okay, thanks. We're going to end there for this session. Remember, obviously, that the conversations are going to go on in subsequent sessions. I'll just... Yes, I'm coming to that. So I'm just, sorry, just to explain. I'm going to hand over to the panelists to say any last words before we break for lunch. I'll just say 2 sentences in response to Taz's very unexpected question. So, you know, I'm not really going to be much help reflecting on it as a teacher, more as a person who's been through the thing. So I think what strikes me about these things is the way that we have these kind of successive waves of struggle that seem to re-raise often similar questions, but sometimes in new ways, you know, and certainly with gender. I mean, there was some students did a Marikana commemoration in August. And it was quite well attended by EFF, but what really struck me there was that it was a women's organization suddenly, which I was a bit surprised by, right? Because historically there's been a sort of machismo sometimes associated with the more militant student formation. So, and certainly it was a very militant gathering, but really the organization, the people who pitched were women, but again, the person doing the call and the shouting and the speeches and so on was a man, right? So it was kind of interesting to me looking at how these kinds of, how again and again, I think what we're seeing is that women and other groups like that, you know, we organize ourselves in these general shakeups within society. It does always seem to lead to groups that have been pushed down having a little bit of a door open to try and look at the possibilities of another world. And I think the other thing that's kind of obvious, but which I suppose we need to keep restating, is that if those movements if they don't achieve bigger structural change, then even if it wins a few demands or many of its direct demands, then a lot of those kind of consequences where doors open to other ways of being and thinking about ourselves can then kind of close again, and we get pushed back into the dark. But I think the other thing to just emphasize, you know, so also one of the reasons that we see youth, I agree with the point about not thinking about these things too much as generations. You know, a friend of mine said about Madagascar, this is not Gen Z, it's every generation is involved in this uprising. You can't call it a generational thing, you know, so I think that's important. But maybe I suppose the thing about youth and young people and students, therefore, is that often at that age we're unschooled in we're unschooled in the lesson that things can't change. And therefore the imagination and the dream and the confidence that things can change in a big way often comes out amongst that layer of people, right? Now, what I want to appeal to us for is that firstly, the importance of events like this and people, someone said yesterday, a student who came along to this came into the room and then sent me a text message saying, am I amongst lecturers? I thought this was about Fees Must Fall. And I was like, yeah, it's 10 years ago. So of course, we have become this next generation, yeah. But I think also remembering that, the importance of building that continuity. And appealing to us that because we're getting older doesn't mean that we have to learn that lesson that things can't change. But I think what we can do, the continuity of coming back to these questions is about getting better at it next time and getting better at understanding how things could potentially go further, what limited things in the past and so on. So I don't know if that really satisfies you, Taz, but that's where my brain went with that. Okay, and then, so sorry, I didn't introduce myself. The reason I'm qualified to chair, I suppose, is because the 80s were my first FMF, and then the FMF was my next FMF. So over to you.
I'll try to keep it really quick. I think my questions are related. The Paulo Freire question. So I did manage to come across some very literal traces within certain activist households, like the Itumeleng household in Nepal, in Sekokune, Godfrey Malekwa, who's was actually in Bakenberg, really far north, but part of the Itumeleng Mokoena area. And then student activists at Turf referred to it, those in interview, not just my interview, but interviews done by Peter Delius and Inik van Kessels, for which you can still find the transcripts at historical papers. Those were done contemporaneously. It did come up quite a lot in reference, but outside of those few activist households, I must say, I don't know if it was in hindsight that it was applied, or if literally it was in the moment was being referenced. And how it came out was mainly through the political discussion reading groups that were held by veteran elders, such as Peter Itumeleng, Joyce Mabudefasi, many other, going across the Congress and BC tradition. And then by the time you get into the mid 80s, the publications that kept coming up as the most viable that were moved around amongst the youth themselves was Learn and Teach magazine and Grassroots. But another trace that links to Freire, but again, it's in the security branch reports of the dead box areas throughout, where it would either be guns or supplies and sometimes literature. But how truthful they ever were in those, I try not use that too much, but Paulo Freire's work is also mentioned in those lists to suggest, and this is the late 80s, around 89, 88, 89. And then, Lucky, in terms of what kind of plays, you're exposing my ignorance, because it wasn't something that I considered. I was looking at different repertoires of struggles, thinking, are you breaking fences? Are you setting up roadblocks? And then people just kept talking to me about plays and these performances. And I said, okay, so because I'm obviously more Marxist than anything else. So I was like, okay, so you were pretending to do theater performances so you could actually have a political discussion about what you're going to do when the trucks arrive on Monday for forced removal. And people were at pains to tell me, no, yes, it served that role. It legitimized why you could have why it would look that way. But it was actually integral to it. It wasn't. So I can't give you, if you read the Lebowa Times, some of the reporting goes into, they'll title the poems, they'll describe, a lot of them were commemorations. It would be to the struggles in Mozambique for independence after 74, to commemorations of 76 every year, then commemorations of Biko's assassination every year, and so forth. So from what I've picked up, it was mainly through traces in the newspaper archive, because I wasn't intelligent enough to ask the questions myself at the time. So it really is future research. And I'm not sure about the stencil work. I didn't ask that either, but maybe Itumeleng knows.
I'm also going to try and keep my answer short, because I think the questions are sort of interlinked, a lot to do with COSAS and after democracy right now. The FMF movement. So I'm going to try to just answer and give a direct answer because I think it pertains to most of the questions. Okay, so in regards, can COSAS do more? The language of COSAS for the youth, COSAS and university students, and what is COSAS doing right now? Is it important now? Does it play an important role since it's still existent in some areas? I know in the Val Triangle there isn't a branch of COSAS right now. So my opinion on that is that it is really all about the objective. And this is why it's important to really understand the objective of an organization. And this is what I speak about in my papers, to really understand what was COSAS in 1980? What was it fighting for? What was it necessarily standing for? Which I think is a very important concept that relates to today, because often at times we might not understand really. Now we may call it manifestos or and so forth, of understanding really what does an organization necessarily stand for at the moment, which in my opinion right now, I do think there is a change in COSAS now compared to COSAS in the 1980s. Objective wise, I do think there is a slight change because, admittedly, COSAS in 1980 and COSAS now, we can't necessarily say it's the same thing. We can't necessarily say that. It is quite different. And even with some of the members, they have admitted that over time, COSAS changed and, perspectives changed and so forth. And like we all agree on, it's because of change in time. And situations might be the same, but there is a cause for change in time. But in relation to COSAS and what it's necessarily doing to the youth, I would say that it doesn't have a voice like the 1980s. And yesterday, one speaker also highlighted how protests in students were able sort of to protest more in the 1980s, of which students right now, high school and university, don't really have the opportunity to do that right now. And that is why I also mentioned, even regards to women, that right now it's different because the youth, even in high school, don't really have what the youth in the 1980s had to really speak and have conversations about women and our society and where our society comes from. Even some areas in, some people don't know necessarily where the areas come from. Some youth and also some students, they don't have knowledge about that. So right now, I don't think that COSAS has a huge voice in South Africa. I don't think that it does. And in connection with students and universities, this is also what I discuss in my paper with COSAS, because COSAS did form, like I said, parent committees. They also formed also the Val Youth Congress. So COSAS and the youth was sort of interlinked in a way. They were very much interlinked. And there were some people who were in university, were 20 years old, who were part of the regional executive Val branch of COSAS, and that was mainly because the regional executives were much older and they had come from COSAS, and they were able to really mobilize students and offer political education to students who were in high school and so forth. So I think that also answers the question really of FMF and COSAS, but I don't think that their role right now, it is widely forgotten, and the legacy of COSAS is widely forgotten. I think, as we mentioned, it's because of change over time, a democratic society, a non-racial society where we focus on equality and equity for everyone, and trying to establish a democracy where everyone or everyone's needs and wants is mostly catered for. And that was really the main idea of COSAS in the 1980s, right? And also really focusing on issues of Black students right now. Yes. So yeah.